what we went through last week was stack zones, MTT phases, and ICM pressure, and then kind of like how to study at home briefly. So kind of like key takeaways from that is just in tournaments specifically, always be aware of how many big blinds your opponents have and you have, because then you can figure out what kind of like stack zone you're in. And then at what point, like, actually this is a question to you guys as a recap for those who were last week. At what phase of the tournament is there the highest ICM pressure?
The bubble in the end.
Bubble and final table.
Bubble and final table, exactly. So bubble and final table, and it'll kind of go in cycles where it's like low, it goes from low to high approaching the bubble, then immediately once the bubble bursts, it's low again, and then it becomes higher as you get to the final table. I know you guys probably have no idea what like ICM is because you missed the last couple. So maybe I'll put you guys to the side and give you like a little quick brief after, but basically just understand that in tournaments, they function different from cash games because of the worth of your chips is different, whereas in cash games, like $1 chip is worth $1, but in tournaments, the value of your chips is dependent on the payout structure, how many players are left, how close you are to like certain pay jumps. So ICM is simply a model for figuring out how much your chips are worth, and basically informs how you should be playing, how wide or tight you should be playing your like range of cards. For example, should you be playing with a fewer set of cards because you're less incentivized to put money in the middle and like lose your tournament life? Because in tournaments, once you're out, you're fully out. Whereas in cash games, if you lose, you can always buy back in. So how much risk it is for you to like bust at any moment really differs at different stages of the tournament. So that's just the main takeaway from ICM. So what are some, for the folks who paid attention last week, what are some main qualities for like when ICM pressure is high, how does this primarily impact our play, and what adjustments should we be making?
Depends on your stack size.
That's right, it does depend on your stack size. ICM impacts differently to low/mid stacks versus larger stacks. What would you say about like, let's say you're like a low stack?
Low stack, it depends on how low you are. If you're significantly lower, you don't have to worry about ICM as much. You have to worry about ICM when you're like 3rd, 4th, 5th, like 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, because you want to not bust before the lowest stacks.
Right, so you're talking about like final table specifically or something?
Or
like,
even approaching the bubble, like
yeah.
say like your final 2 tables and you have like 1st in chip and 2nd in chips and you're significantly higher than like everybody else in chip stack.
Yeah.
Like your get in range 2nd in chips might actually be like pocket kings or better.
Yeah.
You know, you might not want to get in worse than like pocket kings.
Yeah. So what Chen Chen is describing is basically for like mid/low mid stacks, your range becomes a lot tighter. When ICM pressure is high, you're very disincentivized for wanting to put chips in the middle. And he's basically saying there's certain points where like literally the only hands you want to go in with is pocket kings or pocket aces. So that's, I showed them all at once. But basically this is a concept of like for short and mid stacks, generally you're going to want to play a much tighter range. You're going to be doing more raising and folding as opposed to calling. So that's just something to keep in mind for you guys as you play in a tournament when you're like do you guys know what the bubble is in a tournament? So basically in a tournament, like the first like 80% of people who get knocked out, generally speaking 80-85%, like don't make any money, right? And how much money you make in a tournament is purely determined by what ranking you place. So the bubble is the immediate knockout position from not making any money to now making money. So let's say the top 10 players get paid. If there's like 11 players left, then you are on like the money bubble. And that's when ICM pressure is really high, because basically you can just make money by folding. If you just fold a few more times and somebody else busts, you now make money. Whereas, for example, that doesn't really happen in cash games. Like you can't just fold and make money. Generally in cash games, you need to play pots and try to win chips in order to make money. And then, as Chen Chen mentioned, the ICM impacts big stacks differently from smaller stacks. So big stacks get to apply more pressure. They get to play wider. And particularly, I would say they get to apply more pressure on medium stacks because they face a lot of, they have to really tighten up their range because of the prevalence of shorter stacks. And then a last piece, and we'll cover this a bit more, is that generally suited connectors go down in value and high card hands like Ace X and King X go up in value. So when you're thinking about hands that you want to like 3-bet all in with, or like you're going to want to start to prefer some more of the high card hands over suited connectors. We covered a little bit on how to study at home. just basically, I think the homework for everyone, I appreciate that a bunch of people came up to me after last week and went through hands with me. It's just without, like, as we're all trying to get better, the biggest thing you need is data. And so your data in poker is just write down your hands, write down the details like positions, stack size, bet size, etc. And every session, just try to write down like one significant hand that you're confused about or weren't sure if you played right. And you can use a tool like GTO Wizard, or just like ask me or ask like your peers is what I recommend if you're seriously wanting to get better at poker. So today, what we're going to cover is we covered pre-flop ranges very surface level before. I gave you guys like a couple like basic heuristics. So we're going to go a little bit more in depth into pre-flop ranges. And honestly, like I could probably spend, and I personally spent like dozens, if not probably hundreds of hours specific on pre-flop ranges, because if you don't get your pre-flop ranges right, it impacts every other subsequent decision in the game tree, and you end up in like really weird or tricky spots. And I think I mentioned this before, I've had this so many times where like somebody comes to me and tells me the whole hand, and then they're like, oh, but like I didn't know what to do on the river, like I had this big bet, and then I'm like, this, like, basically you should have folded pre-flop. That was like the simple answer, is like if you never played this hand pre-flop, you wouldn't have been in this position in the river. So you do this, and this will like make the biggest impact on your game. So we'll dive a bit into pre-flop, and then because this is my last one before I head to Asia, I will go into a bit into flops. Flops is also very complex, and actually what I'm working on mostly with my coach right now, but we'll kind of like cover it from like a surface level on the different types of flops and bet sizing and things like that. But generally, from a pre-flop perspective, the questions you want to ask yourself, like even before the cards are dealt, before you even seen your hand, first we talked about stack zones, which is like what zone you're in depending on how many big blinds you have. So again, you always want to convert your stack into big blinds and get into a good habit of that. But first, before the cards are even dealt, how many big blinds do you have? Always be aware of this yourself. Do I have 10 big blinds? Do I have 20 big blinds? Do I have 30, 40? And then how many big blinds do the players around me have? The players behind me, the players in front of me. Do I have open shoves off of this stack? So again, open shoves means if it folds to you, do you have a stack size where you just get to go all in, or do you use normal raise sizing? And we looked at stack zones last time, and generally, if you're over 10 big blinds, you don't have as many like open all-ins. Whereas if you're 10 big blinds or less, your primary strategy is just to go all in. So this is going to a direct correlation to like what stack zone you're in. And then lastly, do I have any non-all-in 3-bets? So if you're going to 3-bet, do I get to use a normal 3-bet sizing, or do I have to go all in if I decide to 3-bet? So these are the main questions to ask yourself to basically identify what stack zone am I in, what is my primary strategy, before you even know what cards are dealt to you. And this is where we'll kind of get more into kind of like ranges and kind of identifying what actual hands you should play. When you think about pre-flop ranges, what my coaches taught me and kind of like what I focus on is really just, you don't have to like kind of memorize the whole range. You just think about the boundaries of your range, and then you can kind of work backwards and infer what other hands you can play. For example, like if you know the worst, like what's the worst offsuit hand you play, and let's say it's like ace-5 off. So if the worst offsuit hand you're going to play when your range in this position is ace-5 off, then you just know by inference that ace-6 off plus you're going to play all those hands as well. So you don't even have to think about it, just know what's the worst hand you're going to play. Same thing with pocket pairs. What's the worst pocket pair you're going to play? Is it pocket 5s? Okay, then you play 6s, 7s, 8s, etc. What's the worst suited hand? Maybe it's king 10 suited. So you can play king jack suited, king queen suited. So you don't have to memorize an entire range. You literally just have to think about what's the worst offsuit hand, what's the worst pocket pair, what's the worst suited hand. And then you can kind of ignore this for a second. If you're just thinking about like your range, like those three things, and that will give you a really good idea of the range of hands that you want to play. Any questions on that? Because this is, yes.
How do you, I know you probably talked about this last time, but how do you determine like what's the worst pocket pair, or like what's a good general guideline to start off with, like average?
Yeah. So that's going to largely factor based on your position and your stack size. So this is what we covered last time. And honestly, what you kind of do is you kind of look at the charts and you kind of look at like, okay, in early position with this stack size, this is what it looks like. And I'm going to show a couple.
Okay.
So you kind of get an idea.
Okay.
And then once you know, again, like what that roughly looks like, then you can kind of make some inferences. But that's ultimately what studying is in poker, is like you kind of look at some of the charts, you try to have a general idea, and then you try to simplify and kind of like make inferences based on the general patterns. And then the last one here is like, what is the worst hand I 3-bet all in with if somebody opens to me? So again, it's just thinking about like what are those boundaries? What's the worst hand I would go in with? And then if I see any 2 cards that are stronger than that hand, then I know I should be going all in. Okay, so with that, question to you guys is, if you are 100 big blinds deep and you are in under the gun, so you're first to act after the big blind, what do you think is the worst offsuit? Let's say, what's the worst offsuit ace that you would open with?
10.
Ace 10 off, okay? So you had ace 10 off. What do you think is the worst, or what's the worst pocket pair that you would open with? Someone besides Chen, because I know you know your pre-flop ranges.
Pocket eights.
Pocket eights, okay. Pocket eights I heard.
Like 9s.
Pocket 9s.
Queens.
Pocket queens.
Aces.
Okay.
I feel like
Aces. Okay, we're going higher.
I feel like it also depends on how often you're getting 3-bet at this table.
Fair. Yeah. So that's talking about more of an exploitative adjustment.
Yeah.
If you have more aggressive players at your table, if we're just assuming like no information on our opponents, we're playing game theory optimal. So I heard 8s, 9s, queens, 6s. Okay. So we've got actually quite a wide range. We'll look at it in a second. What do you guys think is the worst suited hand that you would play? Let's say first, what's the worst suited ace that you would play?
I might open every suited ace.
You might open every suited ace? Okay.
3.
So ace deuce suited plus?
Maybe not ace 6 suited.
Maybe not ace. Oh, okay, you know sometimes they don't like. Yeah. It
Everything
has those
but-
tricky ones. Huh?
Everything but 2 and 6, huh?
Everything but ace deuce suited and ace 6 suited. Okay, cool. So similar. Yeah. And then lastly, what's just like the general like worst suited hand you might play? Like, do we think it's Jack 10 suited, Queen Jack suited, King 9 suited?
I mean, maybe 7-8 suited.
Maybe 7-8 suited.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, you got some suited connectors. Yeah. So let's say suited Broadway first.
King 9 suited, Queen 9 suited.
King 9 suited,
Jack
Jack
9
9
suited.
Okay. And then suited connector, but then I'll get someone that's not
Okay, so-
Chen because I know you know all the answers. Yeah, who wants to guess like what's the worst like suited connector you might raise with here?
Well, he said 7-8, so I'm gonna believe him.
I don't know if that's 100% true though.
Okay, cool. We'll see you in a second. So I heard ace 10 off for your worst ace, your worst offsuit ace. I heard pocket 8s, pocket 9s is like maybe the worst, and then somebody said pocket 6s for worst pair. Worst suited ace would be something like ace 3 suited, and then we kick out ace 6 suited, and then we heard what is it, Jack 9 suited, Jack 9 and 7-8 suited.
I'm not a cash game player, so the 100 big blinds confuses me sometimes.
Fair. So now, I mean, this is exactly the exercise that you go through, and you can kind of, and I literally do this in tournaments because in tournaments you're kind of like folding like 90% of the time. You have a lot of downtime, and there's a lot of noise, and you can kind of like I find myself in this like headspace all the time in tournaments. Is like when you're not playing a hand, I'm like, oh, like how sick would it be to like be in first place and make $500,000? That's all my mind. Like my mind just like wanders to all these different places, or like, oh, I'm like hungry or tired or my back hurts. But like whenever I find myself getting distracted, like all that's just noise. I kind of like come back to the game and I just start like counting like the big blinds, like how many big blinds do our opponents have, and even if I'm not in the hand, like I pretend like if I'm like another player and like okay, if they raise, how often should I be betting this flop? But then also before the cards even get dealt, I think about the next hand. Let's say the next hand, I'm in middle position. I have 30 big blinds. What hands am I supposed to be raising with? What's my worst ace, offsuit ace? What's my worst offsuit king? So I think about those. So by the time the cards actually come in that next hand, I just know, like immediately, okay, I'm playing this hand or not, and I'm not. So let's take a look at how we did. So Chen, you said off. So basically, ace jack off plus. We said suited. You get this weird thing and charge for like ace 6 suited is excluded. But yeah, generally speaking, just ace 3 suited plus you're going to be playing. I think you said Jack. You said Jack 9 suited, right? Yeah. So Jack 9 suited. You said King 9 suited. It's got a bit of King 8 suited. So when it's like shaded like partially, that just means like you kind of mix. Like you fold it 70% of the time. You raise with it like 30% of the time. You can just simplify and just be like, I don't know, like you'll just fold all these. But yeah, so King 9 suited, Jack 9 suited, and we said 8-7 suited. So actually these are mostly fold. So I guess it's probably closer to like 10-8, 10-9 suited. But where we got kind of like the most off is that the pocket pairs that you're going to play is actually pocket fours plus. So I think all the answers on the pocket pairs were like too tight. So just now that you know, like if you're 100 big blinds deep in early position, you get to open as wide as pocket fours plus.
So is this saying like pocket four is the same as ace three suited?
It's not saying it's the same. It's just saying if you see these cards and you're under the gun, you should be raising with it. It is strong enough to raise. Is basically what it's saying. So it's not saying they're the same, but they fall within your range of hands that you'll want to raise with. And then I think what's really important is that you kind of remember the shape and like where you start adding. Because like if you know, we talked about a general heuristic is if you're in later position, you get to open with a wider range of hands. That means you get to add more combinations of hands. And it generally shapes like kind of like an arrow. So you see it's like along the diagonal and then it like fills out the sides, like the aces first and the kings. So if we want to think, okay, we're like a couple spots in later position, we want to add maybe 5 or 10% more hands. Where those hands are going to come from is generally like in this region first, like ace X, ace 9, ace 8, king jack, queen jack. You're going to add some more suited combos. So just understand that that's where you start adding hands. And then stuff in like this bottom region down here are kind of like the worst or bottom sort of like 10, 15, 20% of hands. Cool. So this is what like 14.7% of hands looks like, roughly a range like this. And then we talked about how. So I think I know Pei asked this question last week, which was we talked about the genuine heuristic, which is when your stack gets deeper, you're going to be opening with a wider range. In early position, it works a little funkier because you can kind of see with here you're opening with 14.7%, but at 35 big blinds, which is like a third of the stack depth, you're actually opening up a wider range. And this is largely just a function of when you're deep, playing out of position when you're deep just gets kind of complex. You don't want to play as much post flop out of position because positional advantage just plays such a huge factor when you're deeper, which is why you actually kind of tighten up a bit more when you're deep from early position, when you're almost guaranteed to be out of position against somebody who's going to call you. But anyways, so you'll see kind of like you'll now start to widen up a bit as you get shallower at 35 big blinds. You can see like where we're adding hands, like we're adding king jack off, we're adding ace 10 off. I think we added some of these suited. King 8 suited is now mostly raising. Queen 9 suited is mostly raising. Yeah, so this is kind of at 35 big blinds. And then 25 big blinds. This is kind of like the inflection point where you're going to be playing the most amount of hands around this 25 big blinds from early position. So this is roughly what kind of like 17% of hands looks like. And then as you get shallower from here, you actually start to tighten up a bit again. So I'll kind of show you at 15 big blinds. And actually what's really interesting with this one at 15 big blinds, so this is what 14% of hands looks like at 15 big blinds. So you kind of see like, for example, compared to 14% of hands at 100 big blinds, you're playing more like pocket pairs. You've got like some of this suited stuff, whereas 14% of hands at 15 big blinds, one, you're playing fewer pocket pairs. Well, I think we added the ace 10 off because remember at 100 big blinds you didn't have ace 10 off. Basically ace jack off was the cutoff. And basically what this is like, the reason this happens is again kind of like favoring, once you get shallower, you start to favor more of the high card hands. So you're kind of like, you kind of eliminated all of those like suited connectors, so you don't have any of these like low suited connectors anymore. 10-8 suited was getting in there half the time. 10-9 suited you were kind of raising 100% of the time. You don't have that as much here at 15 big blinds, just because basically decisions are going to be mostly pre-flop and on the flop when you're this shallow at only 15 big blinds. So you kind of want hands that just have more immediate equity. So you want to take your high card equity and just like get it all in. Whereas like suited cards, like 7-8 suited, 6-7 suited, they function really well when you play deep because you can eventually make like a flush or a straight and win massive pots. But you just don't really get to realize as much of that equity when you're shallow. So just a really important point about kind of like comparing, even though they're both 14% of hands, the shape of these charts look a bit different and the hand selection looks a bit different too. Any questions about this? I know I'm like going through charts a bunch of charts, which is probably quite foreign to folks. But okay.
Does this change with how many people are at your table?
Yes, it does. So this is all assuming we're playing 9-handed, so pretty standard. As like there's 9 players at the table. The general heuristic as you get fewer hands at the table is that you get to widen your range. So when you're, for example, when you get all the most extreme and when you're down to like heads up, pre-flop you're almost never folding. You get to play almost like 100% of hands, like raise, calling, etc. Whereas obviously we see here you're only playing like 14% of hands, so that's the general heuristic, but when you get fewer and fewer players. Okay, last one we'll show is just like, 10 big blinds under the gun. So main thing to note here is that whereas at 15 big blinds we're playing 14% of hands, at 10 big blinds overall we're playing, if you add these two together, you're playing something like 15.5 to almost 16% of hands. So again, you're increasing the number of hands you play, and now you get to see you're adding all these like pocket pairs, but largely because your preferred strategy here is to go all in, and when your preferred strategy is to go all in, you get to go in with some of these more pocket pairs that are doing okay equity-wise against whatever hands that might call you like 2 overs, like ace king, ace queen, and you get to put maximum fold equity on opponents. So that's generally why you see this range generally open up. And then it is important that you still have a raising strategy, because you're generally going to want to do that with like your best hands, like queens plus. Like instead of jamming or going all in for 10 big blinds, you're going to want to be able to raise, have somebody re-raise over you and kind of like maximize how many chips you can win. And then we didn't really go much into depth in this about like how do you balance your range. But just to kind of show, this is actually a pretty good chart to kind of illustrate it. Is like if you're going to go all in, if you're going to go all in with most of your range, but you're only going to raise with queens, kings, and aces, you need to add some combinations of hands that you're going to raise that aren't your best hands, queens, kings, and aces, just so your opponents like can't just always fold to you when you just raise and just know you always have the best hand. And usually when you're adding bluff combinations to balance your range, it's going to come from your worst offsuit combinations. So that's why you see like ace 9 off and ace, like basically these are like the worst offsuit combinations. You look at like what's the worst offsuit ace that you're going to go all in with, and then you take like 1 pip lower, and that's generally going to be the bluff combination that you add. So this starts to get like more in depth into like range construction and how do you add bluff combos to make sure that you can't be exploited. But that's why this chart looks like the way it is. And then you can sometimes add like a6, a7 suited. How I personally like simplify here is like I just basically jam all of these. I raise with ace, king, queen, and then like I'll basically raise with like ace 9. I'll just basically pure raise with like ace 9 off and like maybe king jack off, and then that's it. So I'll just like simplify for myself and just only raise with those hands as my bluff combos. Any questions about that?
This changes with ICM too, right?
Yes, so this is all chip EV, meaning this is no ICM, and I would say always start studying ranges without ICM, because ICM starts to really complicate things and are quite sensitive. I personally haven't even done that much like ICM study, but I know like the super pros almost like they focus so much time on ICM, because it just gets really complex. But this is no ICM. Yeah. Yes.
The goal here is still to get someone heads up, right? Like, it's like a minus CD play if you let like a third person come in and like have like a 3-person pot. Because you said last time, like the best thing is like heads up in position is the best.
Yes.
Like setup for for profit.
Exactly. So generally speaking in poker, getting heads up, which means like you are just playing against one other player, and if you're in position, that's the most profitable formation in poker. When you're only 10 big blinds deep, and that's generally speaking when you've got some like post-flop playability, you get to like apply pressure and do a bunch of things, but like when you have 10 big blinds, you don't really have much maneuverability at all. So at this point, it doesn't really, you're not thinking as much about getting a player heads up, because almost every time you're just going to be all in pre-flop. So you're not really going to get to play heads up against anyone. And even when you're raising with ace, king, queen, it's not necessarily because you're trying to get like heads up in position. You're just kind of trapping, and you're hoping somebody will re-raise over you, or maybe you get the big blind who will just call, like everyone folds and the big blind calls with like a pretty speculative hand, and then you can at least get a bit more chips out of them. But yeah, so this is slightly different because you're so short. You're mostly going to be getting all in pre-flop. Yeah, but good question. Okay, cool. And then this is kind of like conversely. Actually, I should have asked you guys, but I kind of showed it already. Which is now 100 big blinds deep, but now on the button. So you can remember that like when we were under the gun, it was like 14 point something % of hands. Now this has become 55% of hands. So again, just a pure function of positional advantage and how wide that range will be. But then again, you would do the same exercise. So I know if I'm on the button, okay, what's the worst ace X I can open with? Now I know I can basically open with any ace deuce off plus. I also get king 5 off plus, queen 7 off, jack 8 off. I get all these suited combinations. I almost play any suited card, except for like really garbage ones like 9-2 suited, whatever, 10-2 suited. But yeah, so you get to play all these suited cards. So it just shows you how wide the button range is supposed to be, which also has real strong implications on how wide, if you're in the small blind or the big blind, like how much you should be 3-betting, and just generally to be aware, like if you're playing against somebody who's somewhat studied and understands pre-flop ranges, they're going to be raising with like all this junk. So yeah, just something to be aware of.
Question: If you raise on the button and then the big blind 3-bets you, then and you just have garbage, like do you still like do you call? No. So like generally speaking, if you raise with like 10-5 suited and the big blind 3-bets you, you just fold, right? And of course the big blind's going to have some bluffs, because basically if you're ever what your goal if you want to play game 3 optimal poker is you're always going to have good hands balanced with bad hands. So they're gonna have some bluffs and with a garbage hand like 10-5 suited, even their bluffs are beating you, because their bluffs are going to be like ace 5 off or ace 4 off or something like that, and you're still losing to their bluffs. And if you ever have a hand where you're losing to your opponent's bluffs, then you always want to fold. But even if you had something more, like marginal, like let's say, you have like king 10 suited, or like let's take an offsuit hand, because like generally with the suited hands you're kind of going to be doing more calling. But like if you have king jack off and like they might, or actually let's take like ace 7 off, because you still could be beating their bluffs like ace 5 off, but you're still supposed to be folding, just because it's going to be just absolutely crushed against the value hands in the range. And I was talking to Bear about this. I know we've talked about this, which is like sometimes like you're just supposed to get bluffed, right? Like that they will probably have plenty of bluffs in their range in certain situations, but like you don't need to battle for every single pot. And that's probably my biggest weakness is poker. My coach tells me all the time is like I just want to win like every single pot. I want to battle and I want to go for like max aggression, but like sometimes you're just supposed to get bluffed and like just don't sweat it. Like sure, they might have the ace 5 off one time, but you're not trying to, the way you make money in poker or win is not by trying to find that like couple times where they have ace 5 off and you call them with ace 7 off and you make a sick call. Like it'll happen, but that's not going to be the best way to make money in poker. I would not advise it. You can try it, but yeah, I would just fold your garbage hands, and then you're going to have some bluffs of your own. So you're going to have like, ace 5 suited, they 3-bet you, and then you're going to 4-bet them, and then they're supposed to fold like their hands like ace queen, ace jack. So, but anyways, yeah, most of your garbage hands you're just going to fold. Yes?
So I may have missed this in the previous ones, but like how much do we want to raise in this pre-flop situation? Is it like 3-bet or?
How much? Oh, like sizing?
Yeah, sizing wise.
So in tournaments we talked about, so we covered the last couple of weeks, but basically your sizing is generally going to be between 2 to 3x the big blind. So the big blind in tournaments will constantly change and increase as time goes on, but just always be aware if the big blind's like 20 chips, then 2 times the big blind is 40, 3 times the big blind is like 60, and generally as you get later on in the tournament, you just default to 2x the big blind.
Okay.
I'll say for like beginners, like just to keep it simple, if you just always just use 2 times the big blind throughout the whole tournament, it's not going to be a big mistake. So
is this a cash? Also applies to cash?
Yeah, this because cash games you basically play at 100 big blinds. So when you're playing 100 big blinds deep in a tournament, it kind of like the ranges look basically pretty identical to cash game.
If there are like 4 people in the hand and you're the button and everyone checks on the flop to you, and you can't hit anything, do you continue raising?
So I'll stop you there because immediately we're talking about like a 5-way multi-way pot.
And something that we said on like week 1 is that like in multi-way pots, you just can't win. So like these are generally,
But everyone's checking to you.
so your kind of your strategy in like in multi-way pots is like is generally you're just gonna check all like your garbage hands. If you've got like even if you've got like some medium strength hands, maybe you can bet like one street, but like kind of just like check all your garbage, try to get to like chief showdown with your medium strength.
Okay.
Right. And then your good hands you can start betting.
Even though you were the pre-flop aggressor.
Yeah, like you just like your pre-flop like ideally pre-flop strategies. You're just really trying to not get into a multi-way pot. That's why you 3-bet. That's why you 4-bet. And then even like AI solvers, like they don't really have solutions for like multi-way pots because they get like extremely complex. And
Let's just say there's only one other person, and you hit like you do not hit a good flop. Do you keep betting? Like
well, we're gonna cover that. We're gonna cover flop types and which ones you bet and how often. So that will cover that. Okay, I'm gonna blaze through the rest of this because this now yes.
Is this your range when you call the button against me in a cash game too? Because actually, I don't think I see 9-6 off.
Yeah.
You hit a 2-pair against me.
Tiger, my range calling you on the button is actually totally it's not my range. I just play any 2 cards.
Can you show me your charts?
That's for me to know. You So anyways, I'll just show that the general heuristic we talked about before, which is the deeper you are, the wider your range is quite well illustrated, especially when you're in a late position. So you're going from 55% down to 50%, down to 45 to this is basically 38, and then again like 38%. So you go so as you're getting shallower and shallower, and then you're seeing the same thing which we talked about when you're 10 big blinds or less. You're having a pretty dominant like all-in strategy. You're still going to want to raise with like your premiums, and then where you find your bluffs, it's like your worst offsuit hand. So like, you know, the worst king that you jam with is king 9 off. So you go 1 pip below, and I'll raise with king 8 off as my bluff, and I'll add king 8 off, some king 7 off as my bluff combos to balance my ace king queen. And then I wouldn't really worry about this stuff. Like I don't know, king 9 suited, you're supposed to raise half the time. I just always simplify. I just jam all the time with those kind of hands. Okay, we're gonna skip this because I do want to cover flop. So flop strategy, and so basically 2 main definitions you need to understand when it comes to flops is when you categorize flops is first is dry / static flops. So basically disconnected boards with like disconnected boards, non-suited boards, where kind of like the strong hands are it's unlikely to change with like subsequent cards that come. Whereas wet dynamic is like very, very connected, like 6-5-7, two diamonds. That's a very, very wet flop. And then the strong hands can very likely change. Like 6-5-7, let's say an 8 of diamonds comes on the turn. Now flush is complete, now a bunch of straights complete. So it's a very sort of like wet or dynamic flop. And these 2 things will be kind of like pretty important when you think about categorizing types of flops. When we talk about and we think about bet sizing and bet sizing heuristics on the flop, generally speaking, when your strategy is mostly checking on a certain type of flop, then you should be, if you do choose to bet, you should be betting larger. And then conversely, when your strategy is mostly betting, then you should be betting smaller. So just understand that as a general heuristic, and we'll talk about when should I be mostly checking? When should I be mostly betting? We'll look to kind of simplify that a bit, and then when you see wet flops, especially, you want to bet for a bigger size, generally speaking. So one, you're going to be doing less betting, generally speaking, as the in position player or the pre-flop raiser, and because of that as well, you're going to want to bet for a larger size, and then small size will generally be preferred on dry flops. So we're going to give some examples of what this looks like, but I just kind of categorize like 5, maybe more common types of flops, but honestly you could get like a lot deeper into this and like really break down. But I would, like, for you guys, I would really honestly just focus on kind of like these 5 as like, first is like dry high cards. So what I mean by that is like ace, 7, deuce, rainbow meaning all different suits. So there's no real like straight possibilities except for like maybe 3-4, 3-5. There's no flush possibilities, and and it's a high card, so usually ace, king, queen, or jack, something above like 10 or higher. Then you can see like wet, low card connected flops, so like, again, 6-5-4 of diamonds. High card paired, so think cards that are pairing the high card, so queen, queen, like jack, jack, something, ace, ace, or low card pairs like 5-5-6. And then lastly, like monotone flops, meaning just like all the same suit, basically. So I'll ask you guys like one by one, like what do you think will be the in position player strategy? So first, assume a couple assumptions. Assume that you were the pre-flop raiser, so you raised pre-flop, and then let's say the big blind calls. So and everybody else folded. So you're in the button. Let's just say the button, and then the big blind calls. The big blind checks to you on this flop. How often should you be betting? So think about the in position player, your strategy, and just think about do you think you're mostly betting, mostly checking, mixing, sometimes bet, sometimes check. So what do you guys think on a dry high card flop for the in position player?
You usually bet because it's in your range.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, you usually bet because the ace is in your range. Even if if you don't hit it, you can still take it down on the flop.
Yeah, so basically dry high card boards heavily favor the pre-flop aggressor because the pre-flop aggressor is going to have a lot more aces in their range. There's not that many kind of like two pair combinations that the out of position player can have. They're not really going to be playing like something like 7 deuce, for example. They're not going to be like usually you might get check raised by hands that have flush draws or straight draws or some sort of like backdoor draws, but there's not that many of them here. So when you know you're going to be facing less aggression and you just have a lot more of the better hands here, you have all the ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, you have pocket pairs, etc., then you're going to be basically betting most of the time. And then what sizing do you guys think we use? Small. Yes, exactly. So so we know that we're betting most of the time, then you want to go for a small size. So this one, and in fact, basically you bet 100% of your range. This board is so good for us as the in-position player and pre-flop aggressor that literally any hand that you raise with pre-flop, you are going to be betting with it in position. And you always go for a small size. So yeah, that's basically the strategy here. What do you guys think on a wet, low card connected board? You think check? Mostly checking? Okay. Why mostly checking?
It favors big blind's range.
Yeah. It favors big blind range. So like the big blind player is gonna have a lot more of these like junky low cards that they're calling with. So they have a lot of two pair combinations here, 6-4, 6-5, 4-5, 4-6, whereas we don't really have those in our range as the in-position player. I mean, on the button, we probably have some of those. We have like the suited versions of those, but we don't have the offsuit versions of those. And that's actually really important, is the big blind player is going to be calling with kind of like a lot of more offsuit hands. And when you think about, like let's say a hand like ace king off, if you think about all the offsuit combinations, there's 16 combinations of offsuit, because ace spades with king of diamonds, king of clubs, king of spades, king of hearts, and then etc. So there's 16 combinations of offsuit, but there's only 4 combinations of suited ace king. So the prevalence of the big blind having 4-6 off, 4-5 off gives a massive advantage. They have a lot more two pairs. They're going to have some sets, but also they're just going to have a lot of like draws that they can check raise with. So because of this, you're basically mostly checking. So in some cases, depending on the board, you're going to be checking as much as like 70-80% of the time. And that means that if you're going to be mostly checking, then you're going to want to bet large when you do choose to bet large. Because you're still going to have some hands you want to bet large with. Like for example, like if you flop a set, you're going to want to bet large. Like your good hands, obviously, like you flop a straight. If you have 7-8 suited, you're going to want to bet large because you don't want them to kind of like hit a straight or something, and you want to get the value now before a scary card comes. And the scary card matters not just because they might now make a better hand, but even if they don't make a better hand, it also prevents you from making more money. Because if like another diamond or another 3 comes, even if they don't make the straight, but let's say they had 2 pair and you had a set, you just also, or you had a straight, you just, like, they're just going to be very reluctant to put more money in the middle, so it prevents you from making more money, but also they just now sometimes make the best hand. What do you guys think on high card paired boards?
Mostly betting.
Mostly betting? How come?
You're the pre-flop raiser, then like having high Broadway cards are in your range, so you could have just hit a set.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you're gonna have a lot more queens. You're also just gonna have like a lot more. You're generally gonna have more pocket pairs, and pocket pairs will feel pretty comfortable. Like tens, jacks, kings, aces, even nines, eights will feel pretty comfortable on this kind of flop. So you'll have more trips and pairs, and just have the general range advantage. Even like your ace high, like it's just gonna be the best hand a decent amount of time. So you're gonna be basically again betting 100% of your range and with small size.
Sorry, I wasn't here for this. What position are we?
So we're in position, so we just assume we're on the button. We're on the button playing against the big blind. Okay, last two. So now what do we think on low card paired boards? So like 5-5-6 or like 4-4-3, 4-4-6 kind of boards.
I feel like it's a mix.
Yeah.
Mix, okay. Mix, agree with mix. Were you gonna say something? Just
Yeah,
mix. Okay. Why do you guys think it's a mix?
Because you can check back like some hands that you can get to showdown and win with. You can induce bluffs with ace X. And also...
You mean induce their bluffs when you check back?
Yeah,
Or-
if you have like ace king, you can induce some bluffs on the turn. Like say the turn is like a 7, they can bluff 8x, 4x,
Right.
backdoor flush.
Yeah, they can pick up some draws, yeah. Cool.
I'm not sure though, this is like kind of tricky sometimes.
Yeah, this one's a tricky one. This is literally like spots I was looking at last couple of weeks with my coach. But
I think sometimes you want to bet big too. Like if you have like hands that are for sure the best hand usually, but like
Mhm.
have a lot of vulnerability, like pocket 7s, pocket 8s.
yeah, you might
But
want
I'm
to bet
not
big.
sure.
Yeah, so definitely this is where it gets kind of tricky for sure. I would say the main thing driving the strategy here is going to be, and generally you're going to want to think about like who has like the nut advantage or who has more of the strong hands in the range. As the in position player, you're going to have fewer fives because again it comes back to how many of the offsuit combinations of fives do we have versus the opponent. We have ace 5 suited, maybe we have king 5 suited from if we're raising from the button, and then we have like pocket 6s sometimes, and what are the 5s we have, like 6-5 suited. So that those are like, we've got like maybe 16 combinations of 5s here, whereas our opponent has 5-4 off, or sorry, less than that because obviously there's 5s here, but they have 5-4 off, they have 6-5 off, they have 7-5 off. So largely because our opponent has a lot more trips, they make a lot more trips on this board, we're actually going to be mostly checking. But basically it's going to be, it's quite sensitive. It might be mixing if it's like 6-6-7 or like, but it's like if you do anything from like 50-50 or you just like do mostly checking, it's generally going to be kind of in the right ballpark. But just understand, and honestly I really misplayed personally like paired boards for the longest time. I basically just like, on paired boards, I defaulted to range betting before I even did any flop study. Because I'm like, oh, paired board, like, I just get to bet. But once I saw this, I just realized like how wrong that was and how big of a mistake it was and a pretty big leak. So just know when you have like low paired boards, you're not supposed to be doing as much betting. And they're going to be like raising a lot with their trips or even their straights, backdoors, all that kind of stuff. But it is a tricky one. And then last one here, monotone flops. What do you guys think?
I think it depends if you have one of the suits or not.
Yeah.
Usually.
What will your range? So what do you think your range generally wants to do? As opposed to
Your
your
range should include most suited, right? So
Sorry?
your range should include most, like a lot more suited hands.
Your range will include, will include suited hands. But the big blind also has a lot of suited hands because they're going to be calling with most suited combinations of hands and probably more because we're not opening. I mean, actually, we were kind of opening a lot of suited garbage, but like let's say in this case we're like under the gun, we're actually not opening like a ton of suited hands, and we're definitely fewer suited hands than the big blind would have calling with. So knowing that, what do you guys think?
Let's say small sizing.
Okay, so small sizing, but you still think like then probably betting mostly betting?
I don't know, to be honest.
No, it's a tricky one. Again, I played this wrong, where like on monotone boards, I would like almost, I definitely over c-bet, and this is a pretty common like population tendency as well, is like just to bet the flop too often, and I would almost range bet on like most monotone flops.
My default is just to bet like 25% and see what happens.
Yeah. And I would say generally, like if you just have no idea what to do, like you're looking at this and it's hard to remember, like if you just default to just always betting 25% when in position, it's generally not a terrible strategy in live poker, because population tendency in live poker is that players will play like too passively. So the small bet on the flop overperforms as kind of like an exploitative move, because they're not going to be check raising you as much as they should. They're not going to be calling you as much as they should. Because once you start to study ranges, like they're supposed to be calling you with like a bunch of like junk, like king highs with like some random like back doors, and they're supposed to be raising you with hands that like really savage like bluffs that like most people don't raise with. Which is why, like what Chen just said, which is what I did for the longest time, is I just defaulted to betting 25% on flops, like on every flop. Except for like, with maybe probably 89% of the time, and then with the exception of a flop like 6-5-4, like where it's like, oh, okay, this, I know clearly this flop kind of sucks, so like maybe I'll check those flops. But yeah, that was a pretty big leak of mine that I'm working on. But anyways, I'll show you guys, which is, you're still going to be mostly betting, but basically the main thing from these two is that it mixes. So it mixes a ton, and like the specific cards do quite influence it, from being something more like 50-50 to even like a 80-20, 70-30, 60-40. Like it will be quite sensitive, but just understand that these kind of flops, you are not supposed to be range betting. These are not like, and largely on these monotone flops is generally because the out of position player is going to have a lot more flop flushes. I actually was just studying a spot with my coach on ace 8-4 suited, where we're under the gun. And I was telling Mary about this in the car earlier today. Ace 8-4 suited, the number of flushes that we flop, we have like something like 5 combos of flushes, right? Like king queen suited, like maybe king jack suited, king 10 suited. Yeah, so a couple, and then maybe a couple combinations of like suited connectors. Whereas the out of position player on an ace 8-4 flop suited, they had something like 45 combos of flushes. So literally like 10 times more combos. So because they have such a stronger like amount of combinations of flushes, they just have like a significant like nut advantage on this flop. So we're just not supposed to be betting as much. Whereas I would kind of like always just c-bet this, and probably just got owned in many spots because of it.
Do you want to change, I don't know, I'm just asking you if you know, but do you want to change your sizing on some, like mostly check, mostly bet? Like, do you want to have like 2 sizings?
So this comes down to, I guess Chen is now talking about like, I think I simplified it a bit by, I said like, okay, just think about, small sizing when you're betting most of the time, big sizing when you think you should be checking most of the time. What the computer likes to do is kind of like mix sizings as well, and like on certain flops, like for example, like on certain flops they might have both a small sizing and a big sizing, and it starts to get quite complex. The way my coach simplifies it, I'm just kind of adopting off of him, is he just has one size per flop, but the sizes will vary. Like, so on a board that very much favors us, he'll just always go for like a 25% flop size. But then like on boards like this that are more mixing, he'll do something like a 40% size. And then if he chooses to bet, it will just always be 40% pot, as opposed to like 20% you're betting for 25%, and then like, I don't know, 80% you're betting for like 66%. It's just simplifications, but yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that for most of you guys though. Yes?
What do you mean by mostly check and then large size, IP sizing?
So what I mean is that on this flop, if you're the button player and they check, because there's the big blind's basically supposed to check most of their range. Like on some, we haven't talked about leading or donk betting, and I probably won't get into that for today, but assume that the big blind player checks to you, then you're supposed to mostly check.
Yeah, what is IP sizing?
That means if you choose to bet, then you should choose a larger sizing.
Oh, okay.
So like 66%.
66%?
Yeah, as an example. Okay. any questions? We covered some pre-flop range stuff. We started to dive into flops. I know that this is like a lot of information, but just I think the main takeaways, and if you guys are to apply like anything for today, is just like pay attention to the flops that come on the board, because I think a lot of beginner players just like they don't really like pay attention to like the type of flop and like try to think intentionally about like, okay, should I be betting this, or like at least think about, is this good for my range or is it good for their range? And even if you just look at like, even if you just recognize like one of these in today's game, like you see a flop like king 7 deuce, and all you have to think about is like, okay, that is a really good flop for me as the in position player, and that means I should be betting most of the time. I don't even care if you get the size wrong, like just know that in your head, and that's kind of like one takeaway you guys can have for today. Or like you look at a flop like this and know that's like, okay, that's a terrible flop for me as the in position raiser, so I should be checking a lot. Okay, that's it. That wraps today.